Think Hollywood knows Vikings? Think again. Every time you see a bearded warrior charging into battle wearing those iconic horned helmets, you're watching pure fiction. The real Vikings would probably laugh at what we've been sold as authentic Norse culture. Here's what's really wild. Modern archaeology and historical research have completely shattered almost everything popular culture teaches us about these remarkable people. We're talking about a civilization so advanced and sophisticated that they were performing feats our ancestors thought impossible, while Hollywood keeps showing us the same tired stereotypes. Today, we're discovering 8 myths about Vikings that are 100% historically false, and the truth behind each one will completely change how you see these incredible people. From their actual appearance to their surprising treatment of women, from their genuine religious beliefs to their remarkable achievements in engineering and exploration. Get ready to discover what Vikings were really like, because the historical facts are far more fascinating than any Hollywood fantasy. Number 1. The horned helmet hoax. Vikings never wore them. Let's destroy the biggest Viking myth right off the bat. Those iconic horned helmets never existed in actual Viking culture. Not a single archaeological dig has ever uncovered a horned helmet from the Viking Age. Zero. None. This isn't a case of we haven't found one yet. It's a case of they never made them. Real Viking helmets were simple, practical skull caps designed for one purpose: keeping your head attached to your shoulders during combat. Think about it logically. If you're facing an enemy swinging a sword, axe, or club at your head, the last thing you want is a pair of horns, giving them something extra to grab onto or providing convenient leverage to snap your neck. The horned helmet myth actually comes from 19th century opera. Costume designer Carl Emil Doepler created those dramatic horned helmets in the 1870s for Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle operas. It looked impressive on stage, so artists, cartoonists, and eventually Hollywood ran with it. What started as theatrical costume became historical fact in popular imagination. Modern science confirms what Vikings knew instinctively: horned helmets would be suicide in battle. Biomechanical studies show that horns would create stress concentration points, making the helmet more likely to crack under impact. Vikings were master metalworkers who understood these principles centuries before we had the science to explain them. The few horned helmets that do exist from this period come from ceremonial contexts, not battle. The Sutton Hoo and Vendel helmet plaques show godlike figures with horn-like protrusions, but these were actually stylized birds' beaks and were used for religious ceremonies, not warfare. These ceremonial pieces were likely worn by priests or kings during special rituals, where practicality wasn't the primary concern. What's fascinating is how this myth reveals our modern misunderstanding of Viking priorities. We imagine them as reckless berserkers who valued intimidation over survival, but the reality is they were pragmatic warriors who understood that staying alive was more important than looking scary. Their actual battle gear, chainmail, round shields, and simple helmets was designed by people who knew that function trumps form when your life depends on it. The persistence of this myth also shows how powerful visual media can be in shaping historical perception. Once Wagner's operas popularized the horned helmet image, it became so embedded in popular culture that even serious historical productions continued using it. It's like how we know dinosaurs dragged their tails, even though paleontologists proved that wrong decades ago. Sometimes fiction is more memorable than fact. Number 2. The Vikings never existed as a unified group. Here's something that'll blow your mind. There was never actually a people called the Vikings. The word Viking comes from Old Icelandic meaning creek dweller, or referred to people from the Viking trading region of Norway, but it functioned more like a verb than a noun. People would go a Viking, meaning they'd leave home during summer months to trade and raid. Contemporary writers never used Viking to describe a unified people. They wrote about Norsemen, people from the north, or simply pagans. What we call Viking territory included Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, 3 completely different regions with different leaders, different cultures, and different priorities. Think of it like calling all North Americans the same people just because they live on the same continent. A Danish farmer had about as much in common with a Norwegian mountain dweller as a Texan has with a Canadian. The landscapes alone created vastly different lifestyles. Denmark's fertile plains supported agriculture, while Norway's harsh mountains made seafaring and raiding more attractive. These groups sometimes allied for military campaigns, but they saw themselves as distinct peoples. Modern DNA analysis confirms this diversity. Viking populations show genetic markers from across Europe, indicating extensive intermarriage and cultural exchange rather than a single isolated ethnic group. The term Viking, as we use it today, is essentially a modern invention, popularized by 19th century romantics who wanted to create a unified Nordic identity. This romanticization ignored the complex political realities of medieval Scandinavia, where kingdoms rose and fell, alliances shifted constantly, and local identity mattered far more than any pan-Scandinavian unity. Even within individual regions, there was tremendous diversity. Norway alone contained dozens of small kingdoms and chieftains who spent as much time fighting each other as they did raiding abroad. The idea of unified Viking culture breaks down when you realize that a Norwegian from Bergen might have more in common with a Scottish Islander than with a Swede from Uppsala. Language differences further complicate the unified Viking myth. While Old Norse served as a common tongue for trade and poetry, regional dialects were so distinct that people from different areas might struggle to understand each other. It's like assuming all English speakers share identical cultures just because they use the same basic language. The seasonal nature of going Viking also challenges our unified group concept. Many of the people we call Vikings were part-time raiders who spent most of their year as farmers, craftsmen, or traders. They might join a raiding expedition for one summer, then return to peaceful occupations for years. This wasn't a permanent warrior class, but ordinary people seeking economic opportunities. Understanding this diversity helps explain why Viking Age Scandinavia produced such varied achievements, from Iceland's literary tradition to Russia's trade networks to Normandy's military innovations. These weren't products of a single culture, but of multiple dynamic societies adapting to different challenges and opportunities. Number 3. Vikings weren't exceptionally violent for their time. Hollywood loves showing Vikings as uniquely bloodthirsty savages, but historical evidence tells a different story. Yes, Vikings could be violent, but so was everyone else in medieval Europe. The difference is who was writing the history books. Most records about Viking violence come from Christian monks whose monasteries were raided. Naturally, they weren't going to write glowing reviews of the people who destroyed their homes. Alcuin of York described Viking raids as unprecedented terror, but he was hardly an objective observer. Meanwhile, civilized Christian leaders were committing acts that make Viking raids look like neighborhood disputes. Emperor Charlemagne, celebrated as the father of Europe, massacred over 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day at Verdun in 782 AD. This wasn't battle casualties. This was systematic execution of surrendered enemies. Archaeological evidence shows many Vikings lived peaceful lives as farmers, traders, and craftsmen. They established thriving settlements from Iceland to Russia, often integrating peacefully with local populations. Dublin, founded by Vikings in 841 AD, became Ireland's first major trading city, with its own mint producing the first Irish coins. The violence we associate with Vikings was actually typical for the era. What made Vikings different wasn't their brutality, it was their mobility and the fact that their victims could write about it. Consider the broader context of medieval violence. The Carolingian Empire, held up as a model of Christian civilization, was built on constant warfare. Charlemagne conducted 53 military campaigns during his reign, many involving forced conversion and systematic destruction of pagan sites. The difference is that Charlemagne had court historians writing favorable accounts of his conquests. Viking legal codes, like the Icelandic sagas, actually show sophisticated approaches to conflict resolution. They developed complex systems of compensation for injuries, property damage, and even murder. Rather than endless blood feuds, Viking society preferred financial settlements that restored social balance. This suggests a culture that understood violence's costs and sought alternatives. The famous berserker warriors, often cited as evidence of Viking savagery, were actually rare specialists who used psychological warfare as much as physical violence. Modern analysis suggests berserker behavior might have involved ritual preparation, possibly including psychoactive substances, making it a calculated military tactic rather than random brutality. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows remarkably little evidence of internal violence. Skeletal remains from places like York and Dublin show populations that lived relatively peaceful lives, with injuries more consistent with accidents than warfare. This suggests that Viking society, like most successful civilizations, was built on cooperation rather than constant conflict. The persistence of the violent Viking myth also reflects medieval Christian propaganda needs, portraying Vikings as uniquely savage helped justify Christian military responses and made Viking conversion seem like civilization triumphing over barbarism. This narrative served political purposes that had little to do with historical accuracy. Even Viking warfare, when it occurred, followed established rules and customs. They had concepts of honorable combat, protection for non-combatants, and proper treatment of prisoners. These weren't bloodthirsty savages, but professional warriors operating within cultural constraints that limited unnecessary violence. If you are enjoying Raiding the Past with us, then go ahead and pillage that like button and subscribe for more interesting facts into Midgard living. Number 4. Vikings were settlers, not just raiders. The hit-and-run image of Vikings sailing in, grabbing everything valuable, and disappearing is pure Hollywood fiction. While some Vikings did conduct quick raids, many others established permanent settlements that lasted for centuries. Dublin wasn't just raided by Vikings, it was built by them. By 841 AD, they'd established a thriving city with advanced metalworking, a busy port, and Ireland's first mint. This wasn't temporary occupation. This was urban planning and economic development. York provides another perfect example. Vikings didn't just attack the Anglo-Saxon city, they relocated it closer to the river mouth and rebuilt it as Jorvik, a vibrant trading center that became one of medieval Europe's most important cities. Archaeological evidence shows sophisticated urban planning, advanced sanitation systems, and diverse international trade networks. Iceland owes its entire settlement to Vikings under Ingolfur Arnarson in 874 AD. These weren't raiders passing through. They were families looking for new homes, bringing livestock, tools, and the intention to build permanent communities. Even Normandy demonstrates Viking settlement success. When Norwegian chieftain Rollo was granted land in northern France, his people didn't just occupy it, they adopted French language and culture, eventually becoming the Normans who would conquer England in 1066. Modern genetic studies confirm extensive Viking settlement across Europe, with Scandinavian DNA markers found in populations from Ireland to Russia, indicating not just raiding, but intermarriage and permanent integration. The scale of Viking settlement is staggering when you examine the archaeological record. In England alone, thousands of place names derive from Old Norse, indicating not just temporary presence, but permanent settlement dense enough to influence local language. Viking settlement patterns reveal sophisticated understanding of geography and economics. They consistently chose locations with good harbors, fertile soil, and strategic trade positions. This wasn't random occupation, but careful selection based on long-term viability. Places like Dublin, York, and Kiev became major medieval cities precisely because Vikings recognized their potential. The integration process was remarkably peaceful in many areas. Rather than displacing existing populations, Vikings often intermarried and adopted local customs while contributing their own skills and knowledge. This cultural blending created hybrid societies that combined the best of both traditions. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows impressive infrastructure development. Jorvik had sophisticated drainage systems, organized street layouts, and specialized craft quarters. These weren't temporary camps, but planned communities designed for permanent occupation and growth. The economic impact of Viking settlement extended far beyond their immediate territories. Their trade networks connected previously isolated regions, bringing goods, ideas, and technologies across vast distances. Silver from the Middle East, amber from the Baltic, and furs from Russia all flowed through Viking trading posts. Viking agricultural techniques, adapted to harsh northern climates, often improved local food production. They introduced new crops, livestock breeds, and farming methods that increased yields and supported larger populations. This wasn't conquest through destruction, but development through innovation. The legal and political institutions Vikings established in their settlements often outlasted their political control. The Icelandic Althing, founded in 930 AD, is considered one of the world's oldest parliaments. Similar assemblies in other Viking settlements provided models for democratic governance that influenced later political development. Number 5. Vikings had a complex, structured religion. The godless pagan stereotype comes from Christian writers who couldn't understand or wouldn't acknowledge the sophistication of Norse religion. Vikings weren't godless. They had a complex, hierarchical religious system with established narratives, priestly roles, and sacred practices. Viking cosmology was remarkably sophisticated, describing multiple interconnected realms. Midgard, Earth, was just one of at least 6 realms, connected by Yggdrasil, the world tree. Asgard housed the gods, while Valhalla provided a warrior's paradise. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was systematic theology. Unlike Christianity's temple-based worship, Vikings held natural places sacred. Groves, rivers, and mountains. This wasn't because they were primitive, but because their religion emphasized the divine presence in nature. Modern environmental psychology confirms what Vikings understood intuitively. Natural settings promote spiritual experiences more effectively than enclosed spaces. Viking priests came from family heads and kings, indicating religion's integration with social structure. They performed complex sacrificial rituals involving objects, animals, and occasionally people, practices that, while disturbing to modern sensibilities, demonstrate organized religious hierarchy and established procedures. The oral tradition that preserved Norse mythology required sophisticated memory techniques and storytelling skills. These weren't random folktales, but carefully maintained religious narratives passed down through generations with remarkable consistency, as evidenced by later written sagas. The complexity of Norse mythology rivals any world religion in its depth and sophistication. The pantheon included dozens of gods and goddesses, each with specific roles, relationships, and attributes. Odin wasn't just a war god, but a complex figure associated with wisdom, poetry, magic, and death. This multifaceted characterization reflects sophisticated theological thinking about divine nature and human experience. Viking religious practices varied significantly across regions and time periods, indicating a living tradition that adapted to local conditions rather than rigid dogma. Archaeological evidence shows different communities emphasized different aspects of Norse religion, from warrior cults focused on Odin and Thor to agricultural communities that honored Freyr and fertility deities. The concept of fate, wired in Norse religion, was far more nuanced than simple predestination. Vikings believed in a complex interaction between fate, personal choice, and divine intervention that allowed for human agency while acknowledging forces beyond individual control. This philosophical sophistication challenges stereotypes about primitive pagan thinking. Religious festivals and seasonal celebrations were elaborate affairs that required extensive planning and community cooperation. The blot sacrifices weren't crude rituals, but carefully orchestrated ceremonies that reinforced social bonds, honored the gods, and marked important transitions in the agricultural and social calendar. Viking religious art and symbolism demonstrate remarkable artistic and intellectual achievement. The intricate knotwork, animal designs, and mythological scenes found on runestones, metalwork, and wood carvings required not just artistic skill, but deep understanding of religious symbolism and narrative tradition. The integration of religion with law and governance shows how thoroughly Norse spirituality permeated Viking society. Legal assemblies began with religious ceremonies, oaths were sworn on sacred objects, and judicial decisions often involved divine consultation. This wasn't separation of church and state, but recognition that spiritual and temporal authority were interconnected. Number 6. Vikings were literate and technologically advanced. The ignorant barbarian myth crumbles when you examine Viking achievements in literacy, engineering, and navigation. While they didn't write long texts until later periods, Vikings developed runes, a complex writing system loaded with symbolic meaning that went far beyond simple communication. Each runic letter connected to a word and concept. The F rune meant fio, wealth, cattle, reflecting their sophisticated understanding of economic value in a barter society. Runes carried spiritual significance too, with specific letters connected to particular gods and goddesses. Rune stones throughout Scandinavia display lengthy dedications, personal names, and complex messages. These weren't crude scratches, they were carefully planned inscriptions requiring literacy, artistic skill, and cultural knowledge. Smaller runic inscriptions on combs, weapons, and personal items show widespread literacy among ordinary Vikings. Their naval engineering surpassed anything else in medieval Europe. Viking longships could traverse both open oceans and shallow rivers, allowing unprecedented mobility. These weren't crude boats. They were sophisticated vessels requiring advanced understanding of hydrodynamics, materials science, and construction techniques. Vikings traveled further than any people before the modern age, reaching North America 500 years before Columbus. This required not just courage, but advanced navigation skills, weather prediction, and logistical planning. They established trade networks spanning 4 continents, demonstrating organizational abilities that rival modern corporations. The sophistication of Viking shipbuilding becomes clear when you examine surviving vessels like the Gokstad and Oseberg ships. These weren't simple boats, but engineering marvels that balanced speed, cargo capacity, and seaworthiness in ways that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. The flexible construction allowed them to bend with waves rather than breaking, Viking, while the shallow draft enabled river navigation impossible for other medieval vessels. Viking metallurgy was centuries ahead of most European techniques. They developed pattern welding for swords that created blades stronger and more flexible than solid steel. Their iron extraction and working methods were so advanced that Viking weapons and tools were prized throughout medieval Europe. Archaeological analysis shows they understood heat treatment, carbon content, and alloy composition at levels that suggest systematic experimentation and knowledge transmission. The runic writing system was far more sophisticated than simple alphabet substitution. Different runic alphabets, futharks, evolved for different purposes and regions, showing adaptive development rather than static tradition. Runes could be combined in complex ways to create magical formulas, encode secret messages, or express poetic concepts that had no equivalent in Latin script. Viking mathematical and astronomical knowledge enabled their remarkable navigation achievements. They used sun compasses, crystal navigation aids, and sophisticated understanding of seasonal star patterns to navigate across open oceans with remarkable accuracy. Recent experiments with reconstructed Viking navigation tools confirm they could determine direction and latitude with precision that rivals modern instruments. Their agricultural and environmental management techniques were remarkably advanced for the medieval period. Vikings developed sustainable farming methods adapted to harsh northern climates, including crop rotation systems, selective breeding of livestock, and soil management techniques that maintained productivity for centuries. Archaeological evidence from Greenland and Iceland shows they understood how to work marginal lands without causing environmental degradation. The technological innovations Vikings brought to their settlements often revolutionized local economies. They introduced advanced woodworking techniques, improved metalworking methods, and sophisticated textile production that raised living standards wherever they settled. Their workshops in places like York produced goods that were traded across Europe, indicating industrial-scale production capabilities. Viking legal and administrative systems demonstrate remarkable intellectual sophistication. The Icelandic law codes, preserved in later manuscripts, show complex understanding of property rights, contract law, and dispute resolution that wouldn't be out of place in modern legal systems. Their parliamentary assemblies, things, operated on democratic principles that were centuries ahead of most European governance systems. Number 7. Viking women had remarkable rights and status. Hollywood's portrayal of Viking women as oppressed victims couldn't be further from historical reality. Viking women enjoyed legal rights, social status, and personal freedoms that wouldn't be matched in Christian Europe for centuries. Women controlled household keys, literally and symbolically holding power over property and wealth. When men went raiding or trading, women managed entire communities, making economic decisions, settling disputes, and maintaining social order. This wasn't temporary authority. This was recognized leadership. Archaeological evidence supports the shield maiden concept that Hollywood treats as fantasy. The famous Burka warrior burial contained a woman buried with weapons, tactical gaming pieces, and horses, indicating military leadership roles. While not all Viking women were warriors, some clearly held martial authority. Viking women could divorce their husbands for violence or disrespect, a right that Christian women wouldn't gain for centuries. They could own property, conduct business, and inherit wealth independently. Legal codes show women testifying in court cases and serving as witnesses in important transactions. The Norse goddess Freya held equal status with male gods, governing sex, beauty, gold, and death. She wasn't a subordinate figure, but a powerful deity who commanded respect. This religious equality reflected social attitudes that valued women's contributions beyond childbearing and domestic work. Spiritual roles were common for Viking women, with wands and other religious artifacts found in female graves. These weren't decorative items, but functional tools indicating women's participation in religious ceremonies and possibly leadership roles in spiritual matters. The economic power of Viking women extended far beyond household management. Archaeological evidence shows women involved in textile production, metalworking, and trade activities that generated significant wealth. Some of the richest Viking Age graves belonged to women, indicating they could accumulate and control substantial resources independently. Viking marriage customs gave women remarkable autonomy compared to their European contemporaries. While marriages were often arranged for political or economic reasons, women retained rights to their personal property and could initiate divorce proceedings. The bride price mundur was paid to the woman herself, not her family. giving her immediate economic independence. The concept of the strong woman, Styrk Kona, in Viking culture celebrated female leadership and independence. Saga literature is filled with powerful female characters who shape political events, lead military campaigns, and influence major decisions. While these stories were written later, they reflect cultural values that honored female strength and capability. Viking women's legal status was remarkably advanced. They could represent themselves in court, own land, run businesses, and make contracts without male guardianship. This legal independence was virtually unknown in Christian Europe, where women remained under male authority throughout their lives. The archaeological record reveals Viking women's involvement in long-distance trade and travel. Female graves contain exotic goods from across the known world, indicating women participated in or controlled international commerce. Some women were buried with scales and weights, suggesting they were active merchants rather than passive recipients of trade goods. Educational opportunities for Viking women appear to have been substantial. The prevalence of runic inscriptions by women, the sophisticated textile work requiring mathematical knowledge, and the complex household management responsibilities all suggest women received education that prepared them for leadership roles. The transition to Christianity actually reduced Viking women's status and rights. As Scandinavian societies converted, they adopted Christian laws that restricted women's legal rights, property ownership, and social mobility. The golden age of Viking women's rights ended as European Christian norms replaced traditional Norse customs. Number 8. Vikings were clean, well-groomed, and stylish. The dirty, unkempt barbarian image is completely backwards. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings were remarkably concerned with personal hygiene and appearance, more so than many of their Christian contemporaries. Viking graves contain tweezers, combs, razors, and other grooming tools, indicating daily attention to personal appearance. These weren't crude implements, but finely crafted tools showing sophisticated metalworking and attention to detail. Some combs show intricate decorative patterns, suggesting grooming was both practical and artistic. They didn't live in dark, dirty huts, but often in large, luxurious halls, like the magnificent Heoro described in Beowulf. These were impressive structures designed for feasting, entertainment, and displaying wealth. Archaeological remains show sophisticated construction techniques, decorative elements, and comfortable living spaces. Viking diet was remarkably diverse and nutritious. Evidence from latrines shows they ate elk, bear, puffin, salmon, trout, and various other foods. This wasn't subsistence living. This was a culture that valued good food and had the skills to obtain it from challenging environments. Personal appearance mattered enough that Vikings developed distinctive clothing styles, jewelry, and hairstyles. They traded for silk, silver, and other luxury materials from across the known world. Arab chronicler Ahmad ibn Fadlan described Vikings as tall, well-built people who took great care with their appearance, though he noted some practices that seemed strange to his culture. Modern analysis of Viking textiles shows sophisticated weaving techniques, dye processes, and decorative elements. These people weren't wearing rough animal skins. They were creating complex, colorful clothing that demonstrated both skill and aesthetic sensibility. The variety and quality of Viking grooming tools is remarkable. Archaeological finds include bronze tweezers with decorative inlays, ivory combs with intricate carvings, and razors sharp enough for precise shaving. These tools were often buried with their owners, indicating their personal and cultural importance. Viking bathing practices were notably advanced for medieval Europe. They built saunas and bathhouses, used soap made from animal fats and ash, and bathed regularly, practices that shocked their Christian contemporaries, who associated frequent bathing with vanity or paganism. Saturday was even called Washing Day, Lagardagur, in Old Norse. The cosmetic practices of Vikings included hairstyling, beard grooming, and even makeup. Archaeological evidence suggests both men and women used kohl around their eyes, similar to practices in the Middle East. Hair was elaborately braided and decorated with beads, rings, and other ornaments that indicated social status and personal style. Viking clothing was far more sophisticated than popular images suggest. They wore layered garments made from wool, linen, and silk, often dyed in bright colors using expensive imported materials. The quality of Viking textiles was so renowned that they were traded throughout Europe as luxury goods. Jewelry and personal ornaments were essential elements of Viking appearance. Both men and women wore elaborate brooches, arm rings, necklaces, and finger rings made from silver, gold, and bronze. These weren't just decorative, but served as portable wealth and status symbols that could be traded or given as gifts. The attention to personal appearance extended to dental care. Viking skeletons show evidence of tooth filing and decoration, suggesting cosmetic dental practices. They also used toothpicks and other oral hygiene tools, maintaining dental health that was often superior to their medieval contemporaries. Viking homes contained mirrors made from polished metal, indicating concern with personal appearance that required regular checking and maintenance. These mirrors were often elaborately decorated and were valuable enough to be included in grave goods, showing their importance in daily life. The persistence of the dirty Viking myth reflects medieval Christian propaganda that portrayed pagans as physically and morally unclean. In reality, Viking hygiene standards were often superior to those of their Christian neighbors, who sometimes viewed excessive cleanliness as sinful vanity. These 8 myths represent more than just Hollywood fiction. They're a complete misunderstanding of one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Vikings weren't the savage, ignorant barbarians we've been shown, but sophisticated people who achieved things that seemed impossible for their time. What's remarkable is how accessible these historical truths remain today. You can visit Viking settlements, see their artifacts in museums, and even trace their genetic legacy in modern populations. The real Vikings were explorers, engineers, traders, and settlers who shaped the medieval world in ways we're still discovering. If you have enjoyed raiding the past with us, then go ahead and pillage that like button and subscribe for more interesting facts into Midgard living.